Welcome to IIT Social Sciences Great Problem, Great Minds Seminar Series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like you to know you can submit questions during the webinar by typing in the chat box. We will open the floor to questions at the end of the webinar. Today's speaker is Professor Jessie Poon. Professor Jessie Poon is a professor of geography at the University of Buffalo, the State University of New York. She obtained her PhD from the Ohio State University in geography. She has taught at Georgia University, National University of Singapore, and the University at Buffalo SUNY. She has nearly 100 publications on multinational firms, locational strategies, foreign direct investment, trained technological upgrading dynamics, multinational companies, and skills. These papers uses statistical models to interrogate theoretically and empirically issues of trade, investment, and finance. While she has largely focused on Asian, her more recent publications examine human capital in the United States. Her work has been supported by major research grants from the National Science Foundation. She co-authored a book on international trade in 2017, which has just been translated into Chinese, and has a forthcoming book, Infodemics, that tackles issues of economic and social misinformation in the information economy. She has published her research in top geography journals, including Annals of the American Association of Geographers, Economic Geography, Journal of Economic Geography, and Progress in Human Geography. She was the first female scholar to be appointed an editor in the field of regional science, the journal Papers in Regional Science. She is currently co-editor of Environment and Planning A. She is also the first American to chair the Europe-based Regional Studies Association International. Is very delighted to welcome Professor Jessie Poon.
Thank you, Dr. Hao Huang. I'm very pleased to be here today, and hello to everyone. And I guess this afternoon is an afternoon for everybody on a Thursday, and I appreciate the fact that you're here today. Now, I typically write about trade and investment, as Dr. Wang had mentioned in her introduction, but today I really want to present something which is dear to my heart. I've had this 20-year affair with the Rustbelt, because when I first decided to move to Buffalo, a lot of my friends turned up their noses and basically said, you are going to the deep Rust Belt. So Chicago is one of my favorite cities, by the way, for its, sort of its architecture, but also it's kind of right at the heart of the Rust Belt Revolution as well. Today, I want to first trace, this metaphor and this negative image of the Rust Belt nationally and also internationally. So if we go back to 1984, Mr. Walter Mondale then was a presidential candidate. He was stomping around the Midwest and then ended up in Cleveland, where he addressed a group of steel workers. And he said, Reagan's policies are turning our industrial Midwest into a Rust Bowl. So this imagery of, industries rusting here have caught on, and it's made its way into national media, sometimes international media as well. And then we kind of got that kind of negative image for a very long time. And certainly when President Trump was elected president in 2016, that image was revitalized, and Rust Belt voters were said to be disaffected, unskilled, blue collar workers that actually made Trump president, and some of these headlines here show. So where did this kind of a negative sort of narrative come from? Well, it was populated by some of our very own academics. So let me start with the academics that have populated or set the contrast between the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, which is seen to be then a rising sort of region where innovation, new industries were flocking to, and of course, skilled workers were also flocking to this region. So let's start with Annalise Saxenian's Regional Advantage in 1996. When she basically wrote about the Silicon Valley and Route 128, and basically said, as you can see in her subtitle, Culture and Competition, this idea that there are certain regions like the Silicon Valley which have certain advantages, and some of these advantages have very much to do with it being a technological powerhouse that drive a lot of the innovation and national growth in the United States. 10 years later, she wrote The New Argonauts, again published by Harvard University Press here. Now, Argonauts really, this idea of Argonauts really date back to sort of stories and fables of Greek mythology. This idea in Greek mythology of this hero called Jason, who brought 50 heroes, and went across the rough seas, and the hot desert to try and reclaim this golden fleece. This golden fleece was a ram, like a sheep with wings on it. And once you reclaim it, you become the king. His father was dethroned, right? So he was trying to become the king again. And so this whole story about heroes came to characterize the Silicon Valley. Who are the new Argonauts? These are the foreign born, the basically skilled workers who got their education here in the United States, decided to stay on, and then contributed to the technological changes and development that were happening then in Silicon Valley. So you take, for example, some of these Argonauts. Jerry Yang, he is a co-founder of Yahoo. We look at Eduardo Saverin, he's a co-founder of Facebook. Then we look at today's CEO of Google. His name is Sundar Pichai, and he's from Madras, India. So this whole Argonaut stories is really about the foreign-born's contribution to technological development and innovation in the United States. And then came two other books, Triumph of the City by Edward Glaser and The Great Reset by Richard Florida. Now, amongst geographers, Richard Florida's work is closely followed. He had written a series of books before the Great Reset, where he talked about the creative class and the creative cities. This idea that skilled workers, especially the very educated, that is college educated and above, are attracted to certain kinds of cities. They're not here in the Rust Belt, of course. These cities are mostly in the Sun Belt. I think there was only one city in his top ranking that made it to sort of his creative city, and that was Ann Arbor in Michigan. So the idea that these skilled workers are going to certain cities because these cities have new culture, they're open, they're cosmopolitan, they're cool. He has a whole list of statistical measures to try and figure out what coolness mean. But he introduced the word coolness to kind of capture the kind of cultural character of the skilled worker who wants to be in a sort of more open society in these cities in the South. Edward Glaser cemented that story when he kind of talked about how cities in the Rust Belt were sort of dreary. So I was talking to Dr. Huang earlier about the cold here. So he actually had all these econometric models that showed that cold weather discouraged or disincentivized skilled workers from moving to the Rust Belt. They're all hanging out in the Sun Belt because they're attracted by what he calls the three S's. And the three S's are skills, sun, and suburbs, right? And they're all out there in the suburbs, in the Sun Belt, rather than in the Rust Belt. So this is the kind of the academic scholarship that set up the stage for a somewhat negative narrative of the Rust Belt versus a more positive image of the Sun Belt. But today, before I get to today, let me reinforce some of these narratives with Richard Florida's quotes as well as Edward Glazer's quotes. So Florida said, invest in places that, unlike Detroit, have promises. Detroit was not seen to be a place of promise. Cleveland is not seen to be a place of promise. Neither is Pittsburgh nor Buffalo. And to some extent, he had mixed feelings about Chicago. But, generally cities in the Rust Belt, he says, don't invest in them. And then he goes on to say, we need to let demand for the key products and lifestyles of the old order fall and begin building a new economy based on a new geography. So the old order, that's the Rust Belt. What are the kinds of lifestyles and the key products here? Well, the Walmart kind of products, the $7 t-shirt that is really standardized, really cheap. Everybody looks like each other, because it's supposed to be cheap and standardized. So I wear a $7 Walmart t-shirt that looks like my neighbor's $7 Walmart t-shirt. That's the old order. The new economy, according to him, has got to be more open based on the new geography, which is out in the Sun Belt. Edward Glazer was even more, in some ways, scathing. He said the industrial town was unlike modern capitals of the information age. Its vast factories employed hundreds of thousands of relatively unskilled workers isolated from the world outside. Again, championing this idea that cities here were sort of centers of gravity to unskilled workers, isolated from the world outside, very uncosmopolitan, culturally obsolete, institutions that are also rigid, like unions, labor unions, that is. And so painted this whole very dismal picture of the Rust Belt. Today, I want to bring a more positive story to the Rust Belt. There is this whole new sort of thinking about the Rust Belt. So here you have The Economist screaming in its title, from Rust Belt to Brain Belt. And I want to really talk about the Brain Belt in the Rust Belt to try and change the narrative. So let's examine the brain economy in both regions. Okay, so before I do that, let me present three sort of scholarly perspectives on skills. The first perspective, new growth theory, really came from economics, which basically says that a city or a region's economic growth depends on internal processes. These internal processes are basically skill that allow you to generate new knowledge. And this new knowledge allows you to acquire new technology, and technology becomes a very major driver of economic growth. So they link, at least the scholars of this theory, link growth of a city and growth of a region to human capital. The second theory is more geographical, Alan Scott, who talked about the cognitive cultural economy. So remember, both Florida as well as Glazer considered the Rust Belt to be old and obsolete in terms of its industries, rusting industries, as they put it, right? The Fordist production logics characterize this old industrial order. Later on, I'll speak a little bit more about Fordism, but Henry Ford, most of you know him. I mean, he was really the founder of the Ford auto industry or auto company, right? That then became a very big industry. And what Ford did was he wanted to let the middle class own a car. But for the middle class to own a car, he had to drive down cost. So he exploited what we call economies of scale, which means it's kind of like if you went out and bought one beer, it's more expensive than if you went out and bought 10 beer or 100 beers, because the greater the volume, the lower the cost per unit, right? So this is kind of the idea that if you were to generate mass production, so you standardize products, so that every t-shirt or every car looks like the other car, you can actually bring down cost a lot. And this became sort of the model here, which led to the rise of the industrial heartland in the Rust Belt. Typically, you stand on a sort of assembly line. You are skilled in just one or two tasks. Okay, you perform one or two tasks. You're very narrowly skilled, and because you only perform one or two tasks, you can do it very fast. Okay, it's kind of like if you type something and you do nothing but you type, and you're on the keyboard 8 hours a day, you become a very good typer. And of course, what is interesting is you become very efficient, and it meets all the conditions of economic efficiency. But in the new order, Scott talked about cognitive and cultural symbols becoming more important. So let's take your iPhone, for example. The Apple iPhone is kind of sleek. It's well known for its design, and it has fostered a legion of fans, which when we interviewed Samsung, its competitor, this is what Samsung told us. Samsung said, well, actually, we can show you statistics that our Samsung phone performs better. And so they showed me all their performance metrics, and these metrics, look at, sort of things like, durability of the battery, for instance, how long, their products go for. They even threw their phone down on the floor and showed me it doesn't break, that kind of thing. So from all performance kind of metrics, Samsung looks really good. But the manager turned to me and said, you know what? We can't beat Apple iPhone, because Apple iPhone has your soul. So basically, they're talking about the design, the kind of coolness of Apple products that appeal to its customers. So if you look at the connector, okay, what separates Apple's connectors from many other phones is it is square. Okay, so or laptops, more specifically. So this is a connector that you will find on any Mac books, right? Mac laptops, that is. So we interviewed a company in Taiwan that actually makes these connectors for Apple, for its laptops. And the guy said, he was an engineer, and he said to me, he said, well, we actually were very puzzled as to why Apple wanted these square looking connectors, because, the preferred design is really the round ones, because they're very cheap to make, and they're much easier to actually make, faster in terms of efficiency. So we were really struggling when Apple wanted us to make it square, and to design it very differently. So, but they did. And what he came out of this whole contractual relationship with Apple was, a new appreciation for cool products. So he said, Apple really went after sort of products that reflected sort of the cultural needs of the millennials during the time when Apple was in development, right? So the emphasis, therefore, is on more analytical skills, creative skills, and communication skills. Starbucks. Starbucks is really, what's Starbucks? It sells coffee. So many other stores sell coffee. What's special about Starbucks? Well, if you ask Howard Schultz, its chairman, when he was first developing the product, how he wanted to market the product, he said, well, we really wanted Starbucks to be a place of conversations, a social space. So people could come to Starbucks, drink coffee, and chat. So if you wanted to find a cozy place to chat between your friends or family or colleagues, you think of Starbucks. So again, it was responding sort of the cultural needs of the market at that time, which is why these are the kinds of skills that Scott said are now increasingly important, cognitive and cultural skills that capture the cultural spirit of this generation. The third perspective is what we call wage premium. So why does anyone go to college? Well, there's a whole school of work on what we call wage premium, basically showing that if you went to college and you earn a higher degree, you're going to get a wage premium, meaning to say the returns for investing in a college is a higher wage. Similarly, why would you acquire new skills? The returns from having better and newer skills is a higher wage premium, again, better wages. So there's a lot of empirical evidence to show that skills and wages correlate positively. But what sort of skills? Okay, so before I get to that, let me show you some human capital statistics. It's very descriptive today because I didn't want to bore you with models. Okay, so I'm just going to give you very brief sort of statistical comparisons, what we got from the data, the US Census data, PUMS data. We divided the Southwest, which is defined as the region, so the south of the 36th parallel. So this includes the Southwest, the South, and the Southeastern area with all their cities. And of course, this is the Rust Belt. Okay, we also divided the city into 3 sizes, large, medium, and small. 1 million, and so over 1 million for large cities, 500,000 to 1 million for medium, and then small cities are less than 500,000. So some context. There is some truth in sort of the negative narratives of the Rust Belt. If you look at what we call the negative and slow growing Rust Belt, so let me explain what that is. So in effect, we took anything that was higher than 10% in population growth between 1980 to 2010. If over these 30 years, you experience at least 10% of growth, we group you as under the fast-growing Rust Belt cities. If you had less than 10%, we grouped it as negative and slow-growing Rust Belt cities. So here are all the cities that are really slow-growing or negative. Flint tops it all, negative growth. But if you look at Buffalo, it doesn't do very well either. It's negative. Dayton, Ohio is negative. And Pittsburgh is very, very, very marginal. 2.3% over 30 years is really, really, really marginal, right? And then if you turn to the fast-growing Rust Belt cities, they're not doing any better. 10% over 30 years is, again, very small. The highest is really Grand Rapids in Michigan, or Lafayette in Indiana, and still it's only 73%. Now, bear this in mind because we're going to compare it to the Rust Belt, right? So, the Sun Belt. So there are these 3 regions of the Sun Belt, and as you can see, most of them are positive. And very, very positive, like Las Vegas had 320% growth over this period. And that's like 10% growth per year compared to less than 0.5% growth in many of the Rust Belt cities. So there is some evidence, you might say, for the negative picture about Rust Belt cities. It's depopulating. There seems to be some movement and migration of the populations away from these cities. And they're all coming to the Sun Belt cities, which is exactly what Glazer said. Glazer said, well, these cities in the South are attracting all your skilled workers, and, there's a brain drain in the Rust Belt, and all the brain economy is all, emerging in the Sun Belt, right? So we set out to compare and contrast and see if this story is really true. So here are some of the descriptions on the scale between 1980 and 2010. So these are just simple descriptions of percentages, right? This is a negative and slow growing Rust Belt cities. We divided the scale, which is, anybody with a college and higher degree, okay, into natives and the foreign born. Okay, so in 1980, not surprisingly, very low. Okay, only Buffalo had 1%, but most of the other cities here, like Pittsburgh and all that, had less than 1% of its cities that had a college education that are foreign born. It's a little bit better for skilled natives, but if you add them together, it's really less than 1/5 of the city's population that had a college degree. Okay, then if you look at 2010, 30 years later, this is census data, the figures have risen quite a lot, from 16% to 27%, 14% to 21%. So if you also look at the foreign born, it's gone up not very much, but it's still going up. So if you add them, and if you look at the total shares, they're about 1/3 Okay, so about 1/3 of the population in these cities now have a college degree or higher. Okay, and what is interesting is this red column. Okay, so these are sort of all the foreign born in the cities in 1980, 20% up to 27% in Dayton have a college degree. Okay, so 80% you might say don't have a college degree, correct? So these cities were not very skilled, which is kind of uh, what Mr. Glazer had said, right? But when you look at 2010, of the foreign-born population, you now have like 33, 36%, and in Pittsburgh case, almost 50% of its foreign-born now have a college degree. So that means to say so what this story is telling you is that these cities in the Rust Belt are kind of not that unattractive to the educated. There's more educated natives that are staying here. There's more foreign born who's coming to this area as well. And if we continue the story with the fast growth cities, is the same story, So, there's been an increase in both foreign born as well as native educated in the fast growth cities. And what's more, that those who are coming to these cities, the foreign born, are getting smarter and smarter. I mean, a lot of them are college educated, for example. So we go on to look at the Sunbelt cities. So let's look at Southwestern cities. If you look at the skilled natives, it was already high in 1980. A fifth, much higher than what you saw in the Rust Belt, right? It was also quite high already for the foreign born. San Francisco already had almost 5% of its share of population who were foreign born. It's low, but consider that it was 0.5, 0.7% in the Rust Belt. This is fairly high. When you look at 2010, this part didn't budge a lot. The level of skill or the percentage of skilled natives didn't really increase a whole lot. In fact, it actually went down. So Fresno, Las Vegas, you can see it's either stabilized 14.7, 14.4%, 17% down to 13.6%. Los Angeles from 18.6% to 16.6%. But it was compensated for by an increase in the foreign born. So the overall level is not that much higher. If you look at it, about 20%, it's not that much higher, or 30%, not that much higher than what you saw in the Rust Belt. The exception being San Jose. That's the Silicon Valley. Here you see half of the skilled were foreign born, and the other half were sort of the skilled natives, meaning to say, when I say half, I mean that they have similar shares. Okay, so it's roughly 18.3, 19%. They're very similar. So they get a sort of similar percentage of educated from the foreign born as well as from the natives. Let's look at the Southern Sunbelt. Again, not that much increase. Let's take Houston. There's a bit of a decrease over time in skilled natives, compensated for by foreign born. Again, rather stable, not much increase compared to the Rust Belt. Here, a slight decrease, not that much increase as well in Austin. And Austin, by the way, is considered sort of a technological region, right, or city, right, because it has a lot of innovation in that city. So some of this is compensated for by the increase in the foreign-born skill. But here's the picture. The overall picture is that what we're seeing is that in the Rust Belt, there's been an increase in skilled natives and skilled foreign-born. Here, skilled natives have stabilized. It's the foreign-born that are contributing to sort of the 1/3 of the population that have a college education. You have the same story for the Southeast Sunbelt, with the exception of Miami that I want to draw the attention to. Miami is one of the very, very few cities where the skilled foreign-born is higher than the skilled native. So a lot of the human capital, at least a higher share of the human capital in Miami, is coming actually from the foreign-born. So that was the story I wanted to put out. Let's look at skill ratios. So at the bottom of the screen, I define skill ratio as basically the number of skilled immigrants divided by the number of unskilled immigrants. So these are immigrants or foreign-born with a college degree. These are foreign-born or immigrants with a high school degree. So high school, that's elementary high school. That's about 8 years or less of high school. So you want to have anything over than 1, you know that then that ratio tells you there's more skilled immigrants than unskilled immigrants, right? So not surprising, looking at both types of Rustbelt cities, skill ratio was under 1. So there were more unskilled than skilled workers or immigrants or population in 1980. Okay, all under 1. Okay. 2010, mostly over 1, some very high. Albany had 3.13. Albany is kind of exceptional because we were kind of like, is this Rustbelt or not Rustbelt? So we take it with a pinch of salt, but certainly Pittsburgh is. And Pittsburgh's skill ratio is 3.8. That tells you that there are more immigrants in Pittsburgh that are skilled than unskilled. Okay, let's look at the Sunbelt. Same story, but they were already quite high. In 1980, they were reaching 1. There's lots of cities that were reaching 1 here. And then, not surprisingly, in 2010, mostly over 1, pretty much like the Rustbelt. Same here, under 1, became 1 and slightly over in the southwestern Sunbelt, and certainly the same story for the southeastern Sunbelt metropolitan areas. I don't want to point to bring your attention to Austin, Texas, which I suggested to you earlier is really an innovation city, right? There's a lot of innovation that, from looking at patterns coming out of the city. It's not that much change. The skill ratio hasn't changed very much, okay? And then Las Vegas and Los Angeles, 1.0 is quite low. It's really saying that the number of skilled immigrants is about the same as the number of unskilled immigrants. It's not really high. The highest is really in Gainesville, which is almost 6 times, sort of the skill over the unskilled immigrants that's going to Gainesville. So Florida tends to attract a lot of the skilled immigrants for a number of reasons that we discuss in elsewhere, but I will not discuss in this lecture. Okay, so now we look at what kinds of skills do you find in the Rustbelt. Okay. So earlier, I talked about the Fordist production logics, right? So under Mr. Ford, the kind of skill that was preferred, was narrow. Okay, we call him the brawn worker because, these were the kinds of skills that were sort of, preferred, favored during the time when Fordist production was sort of at its heyday, which is in the early 20th century. Okay, so you perform repetitive and routine tasks because if you routinize task, then the worker can perform it quickly, and repeating the same task allows you economies of scale, which brings down cost per unit. The features of the skills are you need to be manually dexterous. So by dexterity, we simply mean that you're good at sort of holding a tool or grasping a tool and then manipulating objects with that tool, okay? You're good in motor skills. This is synchronization and coordination of your eyes and your hands, right? So you're looking at these workers here on the assembly line. They're doing the same thing the whole day. Very good in putting components that use their eyes and their fingers to coordinate, right? The social process that describes this sort of skill is that the labor process is subordinated. So that's usually you kind of are subjected to supervision from above, so management was much more hierarchical. You translate decisions downwards, and the worker simply takes the decision and does what he's told, right? So there's a lot of deference to authority. You see that kind of brawn-like characteristics of skills in the service sector too, in the low sort of low skilled service sector like McDonald's, for example. So this is your assembly line in McDonald's. And if you know franchisees, your burger comes rather standardized. Okay, you flip it, you add lettuce, you put it between your bread, and it's ready to go. It's fast, it's routinized, it's repetitive. Okay, so it's the same kind of skills that we have seen in the Ford's manufacturing factory. Okay, so what are the kinds of skills that are needed in the new industrial order or today's information and knowledge economy? Well, the World Economic Forum in 2015 said, okay, here are the top 10 skills. Complex problem solving. That's cognitive skill. Coordinating with others. That's a social skill. People management. That's a social skill, but it's also a leadership skill, a management skill. Critical thinking. That's a cognitive skill. Negotiation, that's a social skill. So we are beginning to see in this sort of, in the present times, the shift in emphasis of skills, into these types of cognitive and sort of social skills. Some of that may be explained by the electronics revolution that happened in the 70s and 80s. Obviously, with the electronics revolution, you find that a different set of skills were sort of demanded. Here are the top 10 skills that are projected to be demanded in 2025. Analytical thinking, that's a cognitive skill. Active learning, that's a social skill. Complex problem solving is still important. As you can see in 2015, it's still very important here. It's in number 3. That's a cognitive skill. Cognitive skill in critical thinking, creativity, that Richard Florida talked about, is an important skill. Leadership that we talked about, people management here, this becomes leadership skill is important. Then you have technical skills as well. Okay, so these are some of the sort of emerging skills that the writers have been arguing for in this new industrial order and new economy. So we took cognitive, social, and communication skills and tried to examine them and see how they fare in the Rust Belt. So cognitive skills are really heuristics or schemata to acquire knowledge, guide unknown situations, or solve new problems. And these are all the characteristics that we just talked about that basically measure cognitive skills. You need to be creative, you need to have logical reasoning, you need to be able to problem solve complex problems, you need to have mathematical reasoning, for example. So these are all the characteristics that we use to measure cognitive skill. For social skill, it's defined as collaboration and team coordination. And these are the characteristics. You need to learn how to negotiate, persuade, you need to have emotional intelligence, you need to be service-oriented, and you need to coordinate with other people. So you need to work in a social context with teams rather well. Then there is communication, which is a transmission of information between source and receiver. That would be oral expressions, written expression, active listening, and ICT communication, which refers to your communication using, say, your phone or the internet, for example. So why do these skills matter? Well, under cognitive cultural economy, cognitive skills enable workers to tackle many situations in a wide range of circumstances. Hence, cognitive skills positively affect knowledge development. And we had said earlier in endogenous growth theory that knowledge development is expected to drive endogenous growth of a region because of its contribution to innovation. We also expect that cognitive skills will give you a wage premium, right? Under the circumstances that you need to have returns to skills. Otherwise, why would you want to hire workers with, or why would you as a student acquire cognitive skills unless you expect a return on your wages, right? We distinguish between cognitive analytical and cognitive technical because earlier in the World Economic Forum's list of skills, you notice that they talked about sort of analytical skills, but they also talked about technical skills, like technology types of skills. So we divided it up to two different kinds of cognitive skills. Then there are the non-cognitive skills, and these are your social and communication skills. Why are they important? Because some technical skills can be automated. In fact, a lot of the problems associated with the sort of Rustbelt blue-collar workers is because their work, remember, they are for these workers who stand behind an assembly line. Their task is to simply perform the same sort of work day in, day out. They're very good in it, but you can automate that. And if you automate that, you're out of a job. Now, non-cognitive skills are less replicable. You can't really get a robot to do it. Now, you could argue that with machine learning and all, that machines are doing a very good job in some human interactions. But for those of us and those of you who have dealt with social bots, for instance, which is sort of an algorithm that tries to replicate human interactions or human interaction dynamics, you know that you can confuse a social bot easily if you know how the program is written, right? So I know contexts where I know that the bot is not understanding my question. So it's never like a human being socially interacting with each other. That's the skill that is difficult to replace. And so we want to examine it here. Right at the top of the skill hierarchy is leadership management skill. And that's because this is a skill set that requires sort of a manager to integrate a whole array of skills from technical, social, and cognitive skills, right? So we think of management skills as requiring a multiplicity of different kinds of skills and the ability to integrate these skills. Okay, where's our data coming from? The same sources. PALMS, which is part of the US Census data. We also look at ONAT. Now, ONAT is the largest source or largest database for occupations and skills. I'm going to show you an example of how it looks like in a minute. Okay, we took 100 occupations ranked by PALMS data in terms of their contribution to employment, right? So these are the occupations that had the highest employment. Okay, so this is an example of how ONAT's data looks like. Okay, for an aerospace engineer, you need critical skills. It scores very highly at 72. Anything over 60 is really good. Okay, so if you need these skills like operations monitoring, but you also need complex problem solving. You need active listening. You need speaking. So you need a mix of cognitive and social and communication skill. So we took all these skills and we took all the occupations and we put them into what we call a cluster analysis. Okay, so using cluster analysis, we were able to identify 5 skills associated with the brain economy and 3 skills associated with the brawn economy. So how do you interpret this? Well, let's look at management supervisory skills. These are all the occupations which need management supervisory skills. These are all the occupations which rank really highly on communication skills. So if you were a surgeon, you rank highly on cognitive analytical skill, for example. If you are a computer science analyst, computer science analyst, you rank really highly on cognitive technical skills. So forth. So basically, these are all the occupations that the algorithm clustered as needing, as ranking high on these skills. Brawn, you can see we divided into technical brawn skills and service brawn skills. So if you're a clerk, you rank really highly on routine services. If you're a machinist, you rank really highly on routine technical. Okay. So here are the results when we actually compare Sunbelt and Rustbelt. These are all the occupations in the Sunbelt that rank highly for management supervisory skills and communication skills. So 83 of the 100 occupations were clustered in the Sunbelt in terms of these two skills. These are the skills that are really needed if you were in the top 100 occupations in the Sunbelt. These are the occupations in the Rust Belt. So in the Rust Belt, many of the occupations value cognitive analytical and cognitive technical skills. When it comes to brawn skills, no difference. Okay, there is no difference between brawn technical skills in the Sun Belt or in the Rust Belt. No difference in routine service types of skills between the Sun Belt and Rust Belt. So really, in the skill landscape, what matters actually in this part of the world, analytical and cognitive technical skills. I didn't know if I had time, so I sort of had a whole lot of other slides. I just want to go to one more slide before I come to my summary, since I do see that I have a little bit of time. So in the healthcare sector, where you saw the surgeon being high on sort of cognitive analytical, for example, we look at wage premium, right? So here are the wages, the average wage of Rust Belt cities for healthcare workers, right? These are the natives male, and these are the immigrant males, okay? So the average wage of natives or male natives, okay, is higher than that in the Sunbelt city. The average wage of the male immigrant in the healthcare sector is higher than that in the Sunbelt city. So I think cognitive, analytical, and cognitive technical skills do pay higher wages, or you can say that there's a slight wage premium there. Now, you need more complex models to actually confirm this, okay? But I'm just showing you some preliminary results from here. It's not quite the case for natives female, largely because native females are in nursing, sort of, care kinds of aid jobs. So you see that the wages are lower. Here is the summary. Rust Belt skill ratio is comparable, if not higher than Sun Belt's. Sun Belt's two largest occupational clusters, they favor management, supervisory, and communication skills. Rust Belt's two largest occupational clusters favor cognitive analytical and cognitive technical skills. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank Professor Jessie P's very interesting and also thoughtful presentation to give us a new image of the Rust Belt. And so I think first I will open to the question to see what questions from audience.
Can I apologize? There's this guy who is running out some big machine outside my lawn, and he's obviously adding a lot of noise. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
Okay, great. All right. Okay. So let me hear your question.
Yeah. So let me see the question here. I think I will ask a question, then I will to see what's the question from the audience. So I think like it's very interesting to see the results actually for the Sunbelt is more social and communicative skills, and for the Rust Belt is more cognitive skills. So consider currently actually for the AI technologies become more and more popular used. Do you think actually for the Sunbelt areas, the jobs are actually it's not more replaceable and then the Rust Belt, since their skills is more like social and communicative, but Rust Belt is more like cognitive skills. So there's argument that the cognitive skills can actually be replaced by machine in the AI age. So how you see in the future when the AI technologies are more popularly used, what's the Sunbelt and the Rust Belt future
Right.
demand for the skills?
Right. Artificial intelligence, I remember Andrew Yang when he was stumping for presidential, as a presidential candidate. He talks a lot about artificial intelligence taking over all the work and all the uh, sort of automating away work and things like that, right? So part of the fear, of course, is that automation would basically change the industry so much that certain skills will become obsolete, right? I think uh, what I have seen is that certainly data analysts and data scientists are some of the more important. We see a lot more job growth there, and certainly Silicon Valley has a monopoly on this kind of technology. The problem is that it's not just the information technology sector that I think is driving this economy, right? So I'll tell you the biggest one of the interesting things that's going on in this Rust Belt is that we are here, at least a lot of these cities are turning to healthcare, and there's a lot of innovation in healthcare as well. So medical technology, for instance, I mean, so there are many sources of innovation. For example, AI is one of that. Okay, but and information technology is one of that. But then the US economy is broad enough that it encompasses other sectors as well. And so I think the medical sector has become a sector that perhaps this region can capitalize on in terms of sort of the innovations that are going on here. Now, the other thing about AI is that um, uh, I am not entirely convinced that AI will completely be able to replicate social skills. So I think that there are these sort of brave new world types of conclusions that at some point robots will be exactly like human beings and can do whatever exactly what we ask them to do and all that. um the general trend remains sort of unclear, but at the moment, what we're seeing is that the robotic industry has certainly become very powerful in terms of modeling and imitating human dynamics, but it has not taken over the human brain. And so there are some skills that we still have that a robot and a algorithm cannot completely replicate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Matt, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks a lot for your talk today. It was great. Something you alluded to the other talk that you could give that might give some answers for why this is happening, or explaining some of the outcomes that you've identified today. And I just wonder, because it seems like a pretty big omission, if you, in these other reasons, talk about the role of universities, because in my own experience and research, that's not going to identify in any way the kind of nuances that you've identified today, which are really interesting. But I just think of skilled workers working at, let's say, Pittsburgh, and the primary employer in Pittsburgh is the University of Pittsburgh hospital system. So I see these connections, even if they're not directly connected to the university, these spillover effects happening as a result of the university, and the hub-like effects that are occurring as a function of the university as well. I'd love to hear your input about that.
You are absolutely correct, Matthew. I mean, there is a whole part that I didn't talk about, which is the university industry interrelations, right? So you think about it, even here in Buffalo, this is happening. So the governor has decided that the way to revitalize Buffalo is to connect the university to wider innovations and bring in firms. So firms are coming in to support sort of the medical sector here. So they built a hospital. They built a whole new complex, around sort of the medical healthcare. And so the medical industry requires instruments, they require all kinds of, value chain types of products, and so this was done in anticipation of the fact that if you brought in the hospital with its high technology, you're going to generate multiply effects around the region, because firms will be attracted to provide some of the inputs, that carry the medical value chain, right? So I think absolutely. And so the missing thing, I think, when Florida and Glazer talked about this part of the world, being unskilled and all that, whereas the university, they forgot that a lot of universities in the Rust Belt are very good universities. We still have Carnegie Mellon, the University of Chicago and all that. And it seems to me that was the big missing part of them. They just went out and interviewed these skilled creative workers and asked them why they are not in Buffalo, why they are in Miami, for example, right? And this is what they told them, right? But they had not looked at the structure as well, the industrial structure. And I think we still have a lot of advantage in terms of our university students population. And what's great in what I've shown you is that they were telling us that our educators were all moving out and going to the Sun Belt, because that's where all the hip and cool places are, right? That's where all the amenities and the sun is, right? And what we were seeing is no, there's actually an increase in native educated Americans as well as foreign-born staying in these cities. Either they were coming in from other cities and moving into these cities, or those who had graduated from the universities in the region had decided to stay on. So they are, at the end of the day, some of the new human capital that will hopefully generate a long-term sustainable growth for cities in the region.
Well, so I think I have another question is about in terms of just now you mentioned actually the reason the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt's different is because the regional variation for the occupation, since actually for these different skills, they have a different effect, impacts on different sectors, such as like the healthcare dominated in the Rust Belt areas, and maybe IT actually dominated in the Sun Belt areas. So how do you see these different skills will affect different sectors, will change the city's growth or decline in the future?
When Amazon was trying to locate its second sort of big, warehouse, and then New York went bidded for it, right? And then because of some resistance in New York, it went, to Virginia, for example. But Pittsburgh put a pitch for it. So it's not like Pittsburgh, didn't put a pitch for it. And I know of several cities that tried to pitch for a location, right? Now, we can't outcompete New York City or San Francisco in terms of the absolute size of labor, right, of skilled workers. In terms of absolute size, they still outnumber the cities here. We're just not big enough, when it comes to, I think we have, our human capital level has risen, but we're still very small cities. Buffalo is 1 million or less, for example. So you're talking about New York City, which is much larger. And so the labor pool is larger. And so they had cited the availability of skilled workers as the reason why they're there. But let me give you another example. So we were looking at some of the medical wages, healthcare wages. Let's take an oncologist, for instance, who takes care of cancer, right? We were finding wage premiums in Rust Belt cities So it's actually higher in a city like Buffalo. The wage for an oncologist in Buffalo is actually higher than the wage of an oncologist in Boston. You know, of course, part of the reason for that is because Boston is a much more expensive city to live in, right? So when you control for all these things like cost of living and all that stuff, the premium looks a little better here than that. So it's not uncommon for many of my colleagues who have moved to New York City to say Buffalo was a higher standard of living because we had slightly lower salaries, but when you factor out the cost of living and other things, you know, it was qualitatively better, right? So I think the reason that skilled workers still migrate to Boston is because they think Boston is a great city to live in, you know. So Buffalo having a very negative image, Pittsburgh has a better image, but still Rust Belt cities on the whole have a negative image. So people think we'd rather move to Boston, not aware of the fact that actually there is a slight wage premium here in Rust Belt cities. And I showed you that in that last slide. You know, I showed you in the healthcare sector how, at least for high wage or high skilled males, the wages are actually higher here on average. This was 2010 data. I'll be curious to see when the census data comes out now, whether the numbers have changed, right? But this was 2010. It was looking like, I mean, we were surprised when we saw it. We just thought that Sunbelt wages would be higher, but that certainly wasn't the case when we were looking at that, at this. So I go to class and I tell my students, I ask my students, how many of you are planning to move out of Buffalo and go somewhere else, you know, to the Sun Belt, right? You know, with all these narratives around how bad, you know, the Rust Belt is, and like 2/3 of the class said they were going to move out, right? And then I tell them, I showed them this stuff, and they're like completely surprised, you know. So I think part of it is trying to change the narrative, so that our skill, whatever skill students we have left here in this region, we tell them, hey, lots of people are staying, lots of people are moving here. You know, it's not necessarily sun and beaches out, you know, in California. There's quite a lot of stuff that's keeping people here too.
Okay, thank you. Have any other? I think we already run out of the time. So thank you so much for give this great talk. And we usually appreciate your talk and the talk by applause and to the yeah.
No problem. I know on Zoom it's difficult to do things like that, but I can hear you and some of you sent me messages. So thank you for coming, and glad to see and meet all of you today.
Yeah.
Thank you, Miss.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, bye-bye. Yeah.
Bye. Thanks.